Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Blossoming Together podcast. Today we have a guest speaker on. Her name is Emily. And before we do a proper introduction, me and Kirsten just want to go over the objectives. So objective 1, participants will be able to identify and explain the prevalence and impact of sleep problems among autistic learners and understand the importance of improving sleep quality for this population.
And objective 2 is participants will be able to apply specific behavioral strategies and interventions to improve sleep hygiene and routine for autistic learners across different age groups.
So we have Emily here. Emily is a sleep educator and a behavioral sleep specialist. She's going to come and discuss how to improve sleep in autistic learners.
Yes. So Emily, I did the CEU course that you provided through Ready, Set, Sleep. And there you kind of told me a little bit about how you've worked in the field since the 2000s and has been dedicated to improving sleep amongst autistic individuals since 2010. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, ma'am. I entered the field in 2000, so I've been in the field like 24 years. But I had my babies between like 2008, 2010. Yeah. And I just was suffering with sleep myself. And the more digging I did into, sleep support and sleep help just to get my own sleep and my kids' sleep better, I just realized it was all ABA. And I started thinking about how can these things apply to our learners? Because, I had infants, so it was kind of easy. All of the resources were out there for infants and like very young toddlers, right? Like kind of up to the age of 3, maybe 5, a little bit. But there really wasn't anything out there for kids who were within our population, which was that school-age population, even into the teenage population, even into the adult population. So I did some digging and I learned just kind of trial and error that these same sorts of principles worked and the same sorts of principles applied, but it did take a little finessing. And I was able to play with it within the scope of the ABA services that I was providing for my ABA company. They were super open to me working with families, as long as we were keeping it in our lane of ethics and ABA. They were letting me kind of soar. And I just kept looking for resources, but there really weren't any out there. Greg Hanley was the only one that had anything really going. And that was sort of a 4-hour workshop that he would offer at conferences and things like that. And it was great, really life-changing. But he left the sleep and then went to go do his magic with CFA and FAT. He was the sleep guy before he was the PFA guy. It was really short-lived. And he had a sleep clinic in Western Mass and he closed up shop. And gosh, by 2018, he was sort of 2017 even maybe, he was kind of full-blown PFA. Yeah. So I got a little short window in there with, a mentor, so to speak, just kind of watching what he was doing. But I just sort of kind of took it on my own after that and just enhanced what was going on and continued to do research into the sleep sciences, always keeping it, within the lens of what we do as ABA practitioners and kind of went from there.
Yeah, I can't wait. In a little bit later, we do want to talk about the ABA principles. I just think it's so interesting. I find it that I found your course because I was a new mother who was struggling with sleep myself. Like I wasn't getting any sleep at the time that I did your course. My 1 to 3 month old was not getting any sleep. And I just remember struggling so much with her. And it just reminded me of all the families that I work with who have come to me and said like, oh, I'm having these sleep difficulties. And their children are like 7 to 10 years old. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine struggling with sleep for the next 7 years. So then it inspired me to be like, okay, I need to make a change in this area and be able to actually help. Because I feel like a lot of times what happens is parents or, people who are having sleep difficulties, they'll come to us. But sometimes we find like, okay, it's a little bit outside of our scope. Like I hear you're having this really big challenge. Let's target it by the function. But outside of that, I don't have a lot of resources to offer you. So I'm really grateful for the resources you're providing our community.
Yay! So what's the difference between a sleep consultant and a sleep specialist?
Okay, yes. What's the difference between a sleep consultant and a sleep specialist? So out in kind of the big world, there are certified sleep consultants. They are typically certified between from birth to usually about 5 years. So I've seen a few now coming up to 6 years. But for the most part, it's birth to 5. Some people call themselves sleep specialists. The problem is that if you go look for a sleep specialist, it's going to come up with a medical sleep specialist. So I'm really careful with our certification to make sure that we're putting ourselves as behavioral sleep specialists and that we're not just sleep specialists, because that would be medical. If you look for a sleep specialist, you're going to get someone who's going to rule out apnea, seizures, breathing problems, things like that. Yeah, but we're also not just sleep consultants, because a sleep consultant can go anywhere and get certified. You don't need to have any prerequisites. You can be a high school graduate, you can be a college graduate. But as a certified behavioral sleep specialist, you have to be master's level. You have to be a board certified behavior analyst or an equivalent. You could be a QBA or an IBA now that the BCBA is sort of dissolving in international markets. It really requires a basic level of education and background so that everyone comes in on an even playing field. And so, I mean, that's really what I consider the difference between a behavioral sleep specialist, a sleep specialist, and a sleep consultant. It's really semantic. And you want someone who, if you're talking behaviors, and you are a family that is, struggling with your child with autism or any other diagnosis for that matter, and you're already plugged in to behavioral services, it sort of rings a bell a little bit. And so it's like, oh, this is a behavioral sleep specialist. Okay, well, my kid is receiving behavioral services. So yeah, maybe that's in the same lane.
That makes a lot of sense. Kind of going off of that and like how we target, like typically like the population that I'm using my specialization for is the autistic population. So I really wanted you to kind of break down how important this is for our population and the sleep issues that we see.
Yeah. So I think it's important first and foremost to understand how important sleep is for humans, right? Just from the general sleep sciences, we know that a poorly slept brain, a poorly slept human in general, they're more impulsive. They suffer with poor emotional regulation.
Yeah.
They tend to be more reactive. And they tend to be in a little bit more poor health because they are eating poorly, because poor sleep leads to poor feeding choices. So given those basic things that we know about poor sleep in humans, right? It's not a far leap into the autism population to say, okay, now we take the autistic brain, which fundamentally, as far as we know, with the research we have and the information we have right now, the autistic brain is no different than the human brain, than the average human brain. They have not found it to be fundamentally, differently shaped or different neural pathways or anything like that so far. So assuming that the autistic brain looks physiologically like the human brain, the average human brain, right? The non-autistic brain. We can make some assumptions here to say, okay, a poorly slept child with autism is also going to be reactive, is also going to be impulsive, is also going to have trouble with poor emotional regulation, is also going to have trouble with feeding. And when we say it that way, we go, yeah, that is pretty much every child that walks through our doors. Okay.
So the behavioral challenges, and all the difficulties that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Right. And so then the question comes to me, right, as the person who understands sleep and understands autism and understands the behavior world, I go, well, why aren't we focusing on sleep as a first line of defense for these children? At the very, 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 very minimum, getting them better sleep so we can see, is this impacting their behavior? Are we seeing less intensity? Are we seeing less frequency? Are we seeing greater latencies? Are we seeing, what are we seeing in light of better sleep? The cis goes, if they're better sleeps, they'll probably be slightly better behaved. If anything, they're just showing up as their best selves.
Exactly.
At the
Right.
very minimum.
And I'd never realized like the prevalence of like sleep problems in autistic learners. When we were doing the research for this episode, I learned it was like 40 to 80% of learners might be impacted. And it's not a question I feel like that comes up when I was asking like parents anything like, oh, like how does your like learner sleep? I feel like it's a really important question to ask too, because I mean, if you've been doing it since like the newborn stage and you're like 7 now, it might just be like you're normal. So you don't realize maybe you should share it with your BCBA.
I was just going to note, I think that like a big challenge with it, like a lot of times that parents of autistic learners to us aren't reporting it, is because all parents, I think, are struggling with this, which is like the challenge.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of sleep issues and they're like, oh, this is just an issue outside of the ABA specialist with my autistic learner.
Yep. 100%. And they're also told very early on that their child may never sleep well because of the diagnosis of autism, which we now know to be 100% not true. It's just rhetoric. It's myth, if if we dare use the word myth, but it really just is not substantiated by any kind of data or research that sleep improvements is not possible, right? So they're not mutually exclusive, right? That sleep treatment and the fact that sleep problems are prevalent in the population. Like you said, it's 40 to 80%. Roughly, it's like 43 to 82 or something weird like that. But yeah, 40 to 80%. And I always say, it's not 5%.
It's a large.
We know it's not 5.
No, it's a pretty big chunk.
Right? We know. Right? It's pretty big. And so what I mean about mutual exclusivity is that, just because kids have a diagnosis of autism, a population that is known to suffer with sleep problems does not inherently mean that they are not curable, that it is not treatable just because there's prevalence there.
Right.
And so that's kind of what I combat against every day, is like just myth busting this idea that just because it's a problem means that it has to be a lifelong problem, means that there is no treatment, means that we just have to suffer like this. And families are suffering, and it breaks my heart.
In your experience, when you started like treating some of these sleep difficulties using the strategies that what were some of the like improvements in your autistic learners that you saw?
Well, I mean, behavior reduction, first and foremost, less impulsivity. Kids were calmer. They were, I mean, their goals starting to be met with a more consistent cadence. So we would go from this like wishy-washy up and down and up and down and up and down, and every day looked totally different, to just more linear progress, I would say. Okay. And even if it was, not always trending totally upward, it wasn't up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, right? And
you're seeing the progress more.
Yeah, you're seeing the progress. And just consistency with the kind of human we're showing up to every day. So, we get these kids that it's like every day is a different day. They show up some days and they're just not themselves. And you can tell, just like you can tell with a coworker who hasn't slept well.
Right.
So these emotional variabilities, right? They come into session, and some days they're just a mess, and some days they're ready to learn. And that's a really hard type of student to teach, right?
Yeah.
In any environment. So what we saw was more consistency,
right?
More predictability with progress, a better cadence with progress. We saw more family engagement. We saw parents being happier, parents being more inclined to engage in parent trainings because their parent training for sleep had been so successful. They were more likely to say, okay, what more does this person have to offer me? Because don't forget, the one service that is pervasively left on the table every month is parent training hours.
Right. Yeah.
It's just very engaging. We're not wondering why. It's because we're not bringing anything of value. If you're not bringing anything of value to parent training, parents aren't going to engage.
Why would they come?
Started bringing valuable parent training, which was sleep and maybe feeding, maybe toileting, systems, things that were really tangible beyond how's your child doing? Let's check in. Let's have a casual conversation. parents started to engage more because I don't know, it's just kind of proof that the person coming into your home every day knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, it like gives them that buy-in. Like, again, it's a commitment for them. They're taking time away from their work, their day to attend parent meetings. It's got to be something that they're getting value from.
Yeah. And that's why they cancel all the time. You get parents canceling all the time. Why? I mean, we have to check ourselves a little. I'm going to tell you right now, it's personal.
Yes, it's definitely it, unfortunately. And I think that's like such a good point. We have to be willing to reflect on it.
Yeah. I mean, like, be open to that and say, like, what am I not offering this family that they don't have the buy-in, that they don't want to meet with me? Yeah, that is a point. I don't see that as a them problem. I see that as a me problem. If someone's, canceling on me all the time, like, I have to sit with that a little bit and go like,
what can I do differently to help like this family? Yeah. 100%.
Just a moment of reflection. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Well, with that in mind, we kind of wanted to talk about the like recommended sleep for the different age groups. And I know that we talked about this in the course, and this is something that I feel like a lot of BCBAs who aren't parents don't even realize, because until I became a parent, I didn't realize the importance of those wake windows and the different wake windows for all the different ages. So if you could break that down and help us understand that a little bit.
Yeah. So wake windows are a little bit of a mystery, but you can kind of categorize them and break them down a little bit by age. But the idea behind a wake window is it's the amount of time that the body needs to be awake before it will be accepting of sleep. So, you have to be awake a certain amount of time, and that's different for every body a little bit to some degree. But
these are averages.
Yeah, but these are averages. But you have to be awake a certain amount of time to be able to generate sleep at some point at the end of the day or for a nap or something like that. So these waking windows are constantly expanding in childhood and then into adulthood. And they sort of flatline a little bit in adulthood for a very long time. But if you look at the sleep needs of, let's say, a 1-year-old and the sleep needs of a 5-year-old and the sleep needs of a 9-year-old and the sleep needs of a 13-year-old, they're all going to look different. Well, what looks different about them is the amount of time the body is able to tolerate being awake. So if you look at a 1-year-old, we look at about roughly a 5-hour waking window. Now, that's going to depend on if the child is 12 months, 18 months, 20 months, right? So this
is why we're still counting months.
They're so close together.
Right. Exactly. And the waking window might be different at each of those months, right? Because they're still very young and the waking window is constantly expanding in the first 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Right. And then we look at the 2-year-old and maybe it's about 6 hours roughly. And then the 3-year-old, the nap kind of drops around 3 years old. Now a 3-year-old between 3 and 4 years old might be able to only tolerate 6 hours awake and might need that nap. They might be able to tolerate 12 hours awake, might not need a nap, and might just be okay having just an earlier bedtime. And they kind of fall into this sort of 12 hours awake, 12 hours of sleep, 12 hours awake, 12 hours sleep.
Yeah.
That jump is so tricky. Like it jumps at 3 years old from 6 to 12 hours, and you have to like range. Okay, what's the perfect amount? Where's that like perfect soft spot?
Yes. And so this determines what time bedtime is going to be. So the way this plays out in our learners is that we have many learners who are, let's say, 8 years old, 12 years old, 15 years old, and their parents are still trying to put them to bed at 8 o'clock. Well, that's not going to work for a learner who's older.
Yeah.
But because parents don't understand this idea of waking windows and that my child needs to be awake longer and longer and longer as they get older and older and older, it creates this sleep resistance bedtime behaviors. And very often when we walk into a family, we go, oh, they're 12 and you're putting them to bed at 8. Well, why don't we put them to bed at 10? And then you're not going to have to deal with all these squirrely behaviors for 2 hours every night.
And it's that sleep latency. And we'll talk about like some of the common sleep challenges.
Right. So the family will say it takes them 2 hours to sleep. And I'm like, well, what, to fall asleep. And I'll say, well, they're 12. What time are you putting them to bed? And they'll say like, oh, 8:30. And I'll say like, yeah, that tracks. You're going to get really crummy behaviors from your 12-year-old if you're trying to put them to bed at 8. Like
For
that's
sure will protest.
Yeah.
they for sure will protest. In any home, it has nothing to do with the autism.
Yeah.
Or the Down
Right.
syndrome or the Prader-Willi or the Angelman syndrome or the Fragile X or whatever it is.
This is just people.
This is just people.
They're probably cranky from the night before, right? Like, okay, say you put them down really early and we had this like big resistance. And now we finally go to bed. Maybe it's really late and we wake up and we still feel really crummy. So then the parents are like, let's put them to bed a little earlier to try to get them to sleep a little longer. And it becomes this really long cycle.
Kirsten knows I call it the toilet bowl swirl of problems. It's just like one thing leads to the next and it just like flushes right down the toilet.
We're all going down.
We're all going down.
I wanted to pause for our first code word is actually going to be sleep.
The question I have for you, Emily, is how can caregivers and practitioners identify if a child is getting enough sleep considering individual variability? It's hard to guess. I know we talked about the wake windows, but outside of that, how can I know my learners getting the most sleep that they need?
Yeah. So we kind of start with the wake windows just to give sort of an average. So we would know that, let's say, a 5-year-old who's only getting 6 hours of sleep, we would know that's not enough, right? So straight off the bat, we can just say, okay, that's definitely not enough for a child that age. But beyond those sort of age-related averages, we look at daytime functioning. We look at, first of all, happiness. Is the child happy? Are they making progress? Are they eating okay? And that's a little bit tricky in our population because we do have some finicky eaters. But, are they either worse or better than any certain day? And we can look at behaviors, right? Are they easy to get out of bed in the morning? Are we dragging them out of bed in the morning? Is wake up very difficult? I mean, morning wake up time is the best way to tell if the child is or isn't getting enough sleep. Because if they're waking up on their own in the morning and they seem rather happy to get out of bed, we can assume that they've probably gotten a decent amount of sleep. And then, on the other side, if they're being dragged out of bed or families are saying they're just having a really hard waking them in the morning, I would say that that's a red flag that they're really not getting enough sleep. We have a lot of kids who have multiple night awakenings who are still getting plenty of sleep. And that's because they're waking up in their naturally light phases of sleep where a waking would most likely occur. So even if a child is waking up multiple times a night, it's very possible that they're getting enough total sleep and they're getting quality sleep, even though the caregiver is not.
Yes. Caregiver in that situation might not.
Right. But it's very possible that the child themselves might be getting okay sleep. I mean, we still want to get rid of those multiple night awakenings because they're impacting the family quality of life. But we can't just look at that alone and say they wake up 27 times a night, so they must be poorly slept. Sometimes they wake up 27 times a night just to get back to sleep.
Right.
And then they go back to sleep and it's the parent that's up for another hour until they wake up again.
I think that brings up a good point with like the multiple night awakenings with, I think like you mentioned this before, everybody has like these lighter phases of sleep and we are all like adults and children alike are all waking in the night. It's just we have the ability to independently fall back asleep. Right. Whereas our kiddos, like especially our autistic learners, might have these sleep dependencies that are interrupting them.
Yeah. We all wake up all night long. We don't sleep like a rainbow arc. We don't like fall asleep at bedtime and then wake up at the treasure chest in the morning, right? Like we don't just fall asleep and wake up. And I think that's a big misconception about sleep in general is that, parents will report to us, yeah, they fall asleep just fine, but they wake up, they won't stay asleep. They wake up all night long, right? And that's because of how sleep is designed and shapes up in the brain. It comes down to sleep architecture where we have these light awakenings all night long. And like you said, Crucia, we put ourselves back to sleep. And when we look at the young child, if they're falling asleep under certain conditions, like the lights on or mom's laying with me or I'm drinking a bottle to sleep or something like that. When they get into their lighter phases of sleep after like 1 a.m., 2 a.m., everything is gone. So how are they going to fall back asleep? It's sort of this assumption that because they fall asleep at bedtime, they should just naturally stay asleep, except nobody stays asleep. We all wake up. So really, here's where it comes down to like, okay, BCBA, are you going to ABC that behavior and just like tell parents the child just needs to learn how to stay in bed? So we just walk them back to bed so they learn. I can guarantee you the child hasn't forgotten what their bed is for. They're just trying to access the primary reinforcer that is sleep, right? So they get out of bed to go get a caregiver to say, I need help getting back to sleep. I want to access that primary reinforcer again. I don't want to just be a dork in the middle of the night. I don't want to play with you in the middle of the night. I don't want to just like, run around and do whatever in the middle of the night. I really want to just get back to sleep. And because they couldn't do it independently in the beginning of the night, they're not going to be able to do it multiple times throughout the night.
Is that something you work on, like trying to get them to fall asleep independently?
Yeah.
Without like the help of a caregiver?
Yeah, without the help of anything. And it could be anything, like I said, a light on. And it's so funny because around like 5 years old, 6, 7 years old, kids develop these fears and they want to sleep with the light on. And that's fine. But then once they fall asleep, the caregiver goes in and they turn the light off. Well, if you think a child is afraid of the dark at 8 o'clock, they're still going to be afraid of the dark at 2 a.m. So why are we going in and turning the light out, right? Well, we want to be energy efficient. We don't want fires to start. Like, of course, like it's the smart thing. Caregivers do that because they're smart and because they're thinking ahead, but they're not thinking in the scope of sleep and sleep maintenance. So, that very action, that very normal, common, happens in every house action can just destroy sleep.
Yes.
Yeah. So
that's so interesting.
Take place at bedtime and not in the middle of the night. Yeah.
So what are some typical sleep stealers or environmental factors that disrupt sleep patterns for autistic learners or individuals? I know you mentioned, say, like some of the light, say like the light was on versus off. Are there any other ones?
Yeah. So the light on versus off, these sleep dependencies, if we want to look at those as like kind of an isolated group of like SDs, let's call them, just kind of this category. Those are the things that are really going to cause middle of the night awakenings. Those are pretty certain to, if the sleep dependency is there at fall asleep time and then disappears after the child falls asleep, whatever that is, that's going to be your middle of the night awakening recipe. When we look at these other sleep complaints, which are, it just takes my child a long time to fall asleep. They won't fall asleep unless they can't fall asleep unless they need to blank before blank, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Those come down to more like these setting events that are preventing healthy sleep onset, which sometimes lead to these sleep dependencies. But, we look at things like screen time. Screen time is just awful for the human brain at bedtime because it just suppresses our melatonin production. So the other sleep hormones never get the signal that it's time to sleep. So we get major sleep latency with our learners who are screen dependent and who are falling asleep with their screens. They tend to fall asleep 2 to 3 hours later than what their natural bedtime probably should have been. Their fall asleep time. The other sleep stealer would be like up and down vestibular motion, jumping or running, crashing, anything that falls into that very common myth of getting the wiggles out before bed for whatever reason.
Run them around the house.
Oh my gosh. Like the internet tells families to burn their energy off before bed, but it's just incompatible with sleep because it raises the core temperature. It raises the heart rate. It brings adrenaline into the picture, and all of those things sabotage that beautiful, calming, falling asleep, body readiness that, our brains and bodies need in order to generate sleep. And those are two things that are really pervasive in our community, right? Screen time and up and down vestibular motion. But just because a learner engages in those things doesn't mean they can't learn to not do that. So again, it comes back to seeing the child's potential and saying, okay, we know that they're screen addicted or really screen dependent. Does that mean they're going to be screen dependent forever? No, that's where we come in because we're BCBAs and we're awesome. And we can teach offset, and we can teach relinquishment, and we can teach cessation, and we can teach them to do it without, having a meltdown. We can teach it in a mindful, compassionate way where we're easing the child out of that, transitioning to like, let's say, a different kind of activity. So if they tend to have a lot of up and down vestibular motion, we just do a preference assessment for alternative sensory experiences that are also going to be pleasing, and they're also going to be tolerated, but that are more compatible with sleep, let's say. And then do
you have examples? Sorry.
I think we're doing of alternatives. Well, squeezing, rocking. We can do like burrito rolls, deep pressure massage, even fine motor sensory play. You could do like rice and beans, or you can do kinetic sand, Play-Doh, clay, things like that.
What about like puzzles or those like closed-ended mind activities? Are those beneficial?
So I would consider that so that would be an alternative to a couple things. That would be an alternative to screen time and an alternative to up and down vestibular motion or any of that running around, because it's incompatible, right? Like you can't really very well put a puzzle piece together while you're running around. I mean, we try to do that in clinics, right? We always see the BTs like running around after the child with like a board puzzle, and they're running around. The child's running around with the puzzle piece, and we're like, put it together. Put together. Like, it happens all the time. We want to refrain from that and take that as a learning opportunity that, hey, this child has a sensory profile that probably is an indication of a bigger sleep problem later at night. So it's in the child's best interest, in the family's best interest, to teach them offset, to teach them that they can feel okay in their bodies while they're sitting still. But it takes some finessing, and it takes some maybe collaboration with occupational therapy, and, preference assessments and things like that. What kills me is when we make the assumption that the child likes it and that's all they like to do, and that it's the only thing that makes them happy, whether we're talking about screen time or this kind of like high impact sensory input. I think we do the child a disservice by making that assumption.
Right. Like it's on us to be
I definitely agree.
Skills and those play skills.
We want them to feel happy, and we want them to feel calm, and we want them to be relaxed. And just like Hanley said, like HRE, right? Happy, relaxed, and engaged.
Relaxed, engaged.
How are you relaxed? Right. How are you relaxed when you cannot stop your body at all, where it feels irritating to be sitting still? The body can learn to feel good that way. It can. We see it all the time. We just need to pay attention.
And some of these things, like you want to think about, are like as BCBAs when we're helping families who do have these sleep challenges, before you jump into maybe like sleep training or anything, these are those prerequisite skills and things that we need to work on, like the ability to eliminate screen time an hour before bed. Those alternatives, if we can't do those things, your sleep training isn't going to be worth it.
Yeah.
No.
We can't just walk in there and put something together in isolation without looking at the whole picture. And sleep is no different. I always say, like, we wouldn't teach a child to cross the street at a major intersection on day one of treatment. No, we're going to work on stop and go in the living room, right? We're not going to take them out to the street. But so often we look at sleep as this sort of, I don't know, this like special thing that kids should just want to be calm at bedtime. They should just want to sleep. But it's a reinforcer.
But it's not always the case.
Right. Because it is a reinforcer, and it is susceptible to manipulation, and it can become devalued. So if you're devaluing the reinforcing value of sleep, it's going to be really hard to put a sleep plan in place without all those other variables being controlled for.
Yeah.
Are there any other sleep stealers or barriers you would consider? I know when we talked a little bit, you had mentioned like puberty and medical issues as well, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And so like, puberty, there's a huge sleep phase shift in puberty that people just don't know about. It's been researched since the 70s. People think it's just because kids are on their phones and kids are, engaging in more screen time. And I think that's a factor nowadays. I can say that because I'm an old lady. But, you can see that, nowadays, these days.
The kiddos are on their phone.
Exactly. I do think that is a growing variable, and I do think it's more significant now than it was, let's say, 10 years ago. But if we go before 10 years ago, if we go to the late 70s, early 80s, teenagers were still going to bed closer to 11 o'clock or later because of this sleep phase shift, because of the hormonal problems that are problems. I call them problems because I have two teenagers. It is a problem. Hormones are problematic. But there is a sleep phase shift there. And so we have to have these reasonable expectations for teenagers, right? It's like the 12-year-old, the 13-year-old that is being put to bed at 8 o'clock, right? It's just not going to work.
Yeah.
Under anybody's roof. If I put my 14 and my 16-year-old to sleep at 8, they would be mutiny. They would just revolt and they would lock me in my bedroom and say,
you go to sleep.
You go to sleep. You do it, right? So there is the sleep phase shift that happens in adolescence. And then, we do look at these medical comorbidities that we always want to be very aware of. But I don't ever look at a medical comorbidity and say, okay, we shouldn't treat because of that medical comorbidity, because everything we're doing really falls into the ethical do no harm category, where we're changing sleep schedules. Maybe we're offering sleep at a better time. We're restricting iPad time, which I have yet to find a medical diagnosis that is like reliant on iPad consumption before bed, right? So we're just fostering these healthier sleep habits, sleep hygiene, if you will, that, a calming bedtime routine, everybody needs that. I don't care what diagnosis you have, you need a calming bedtime routine.
Can you provide an example of what, I know that every sleep routine for a kid's going to be different, but what would a general idea for some parents who might be listening or BCBAs to recommend? What would that routine look like?
Yeah. What I will say is myth bust number, 276,420 is that you don't have to read at bedtime. I think a lot of families get stuck in there has to be books at bedtime because that's what the internet tells them. But many of our learners and many average toddlers out in the universe, they won't sit for a book.
Right.
And so if they're not sitting for a book, they're probably running around the room. In my observation. So a calming bedtime routine at any age, right? A calming bedtime routine at any age could be a long bath. A nice warm bath. A lot of our population really enjoy water and enjoy that time in the bath. Even if it's active, that's okay. They're not running and jumping and really pumping out that adrenaline from some excitement in the bath. So it's okay if the child gets a little excited in the bath. But a warm bath will actually cool our core temperature. It's one of the beauties of our, whatever it is, sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. I always forget which one controls which. But basically, when we heat our skin, it cools our core. And when we cool our skin, it heats our core. It's just how we're designed. So a nice warm bath is really great. For some of our learners that are very screen dependent and, vestibular motion dependent, we can teach those one-step play skills. They can do put-ins, they can do matching, they can do folder tasks, they can do some sensory input, we can do some coloring, we can do wiki sticks, we can do clay or Play-Doh or kinetic sand, we can do building, we can do cars as long as it doesn't escalate the child. We just want to kind of do that play repertoire, that simple play repertoire for anything that's incompatible with running, jumping, crashing, and screen time. And that will build up to a nice calming bedtime routine. The order doesn't much matter unless we have children who have a really difficult time transitioning away from those things, in which case we would want to do some kind of a descending preference hierarchy, where we're starting with maybe the most exciting activity and then sort of decreasing in value and engagement, kind of easing closer and closer towards bedtime, some kind of a descending phase.
Would you consider, depending on how old the learner is, a chore in between that really highly preferred activity to more of a descending activity? Hey, let's go put our dirty clothes in the laundry basket before we get ready to bed. Would that be one?
I would say it depends on the learner. And this is where the beauty of ABA comes in, because we're not like one trick ponies. We can look at the learner and go, okay, putting the laundry away is going to cause behavioral escalation in this child. So we wouldn't want to do that. Right. Whereas like my own kids were like helper von helper pants. Like they wanted to do anything to be helpful when they were little. So putting the laundry away, cleaning up was fun for them. They loved it. They loved helping. They loved we never called it cleaning up. We called tidying up. Let's tidy up before bed so our whole body can feel nice and organized. And I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to spin. How you spin it. But yeah, I mean, there are some learners where some chores, I mean, especially the kids who might respond very well to heavy lifting.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was thinking.
Yes. So heavy work can be really great for bedtime. Absolutely. But if they're aversive to it, you got to do that preference assessment, that hierarchy.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, putting clothes away, unloading the dishwasher, if they're able to and families feel good with that. Yeah, those things can be relaxing to some people. I think it just comes down to what really works for the family, what works for the child, what falls into the either neutral or preferred category. It doesn't have to be highly preferred. It doesn't have to be exciting. It doesn't have to be like top of the list. I aim for neutral. As long as it's neutral, it's going to work.
When I'm helping families establish their bedtime routines, I've been like, not cautioning, but yes, cautioning parents away from is a lot of parents that I'm working with still offer, like with my younger learners, like they have a bottle before bed. So I'm like, okay, if you're still providing bottles at bedtime, I always have them do it earlier in the bedtime routine so that we help them avoid that sleep dependency of falling asleep on the bottle. Because in the night, they're going to wake up like with those multiple night awakenings and seek out the bottle to fall back asleep because they're dependent on it.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Yeah, I mean, think about the bottle. The bottle, they drink the bottle, then the bottle's empty, but they've fallen asleep on the bottle. And now they wake up at 2 a.m. and they're like, I need to suck to sleep again because that's how I fell asleep at bedtime. So yeah, the bottle can very quickly become a deficient sleep dependency over 4 months.
Yeah.
I mean, 4 months, between 4 and 6 months is when the bottle goes from awesome to like, oh my God, why is my child waking up every hour?
And this
is that why people start sleep training around 4 to 5 months? Kind of. Yeah. Do you know?
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. In fact, really, like when we look at the sleep sciences where the research has been done on sleep training, and now we're talking about sleep training in the traditional sense, we're talking about like a Ferber, which would be like a graduated extinction or a full extinction. I mean, it doesn't really matter. The sweet spot for doing that is really 4 to 6 months, because here's where the sleep sciences and the behavioral sciences kind of commingle a little bit is what happens around 6 months behaviorally. Behavior becomes contingent. Right?
I'm learning that.
Right? And so we don't want the child to necessarily, this is going to be, I'm trying to think about how to say this without being like controversial, but we don't want the child developing the habit of crying to get the attention just for the sake of going to sleep. We want to be able to determine. And this isn't to say you should ignore your baby when they cry. I'm not saying that. That is not what I'm saying. But these cried out methods have a shelf life and they have a sweet spot because behavior becomes contingent over 6 months.
Okay.
I think that's a better way of saying it.
Yeah.
Right.
And it really
that makes sense.
Yeah. So, doing it before then, we're likely to get less crying, less behavioral feedback, less pushback, less of that aversive response. And we're likely to get more of it over 6 months. So yeah. So to your point, Yusra, that's why we encourage families to do it between 4 and 6 months. It's possible to do it over 6 months. Of course, people do it all the time, but we get bigger behaviors. We get bigger abandonment of the process. Parents just abandon it because it becomes too behavioral and intolerable for them. And for that reason, us awesome ABA special, BCBAs, ABA, fans, we go, okay, it doesn't always have to be extinction. It could be fading, it could be shaping, it could be, all kinds of different easing in, de-escalating methods to teach the same skill. Right. We have a much wider toolbox. Like we just have a much more robust toolbox to work from. Even though I think a lot of BCBAs always fall back onto extinction when it comes to sleep stuff anyway, but they don't have to. The sleep.
Well, until today, until Kirsten and you, like that's kind of what I always thought as well. I was like, oh yeah, just leave them in their bed. They'll figure it out.
Yeah. Which isn't untrue for very young children and infants. It's not untrue.
And you had success with, I think the Ferber method when Kenzo was, I think, 6 months-ish.
Yep. No, we did that right at 4 months. Went to her 4-month birthday. And it was very successful for us. I think the first day took 30 minutes. And after that, we were smooth sailing.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. And it is that quick in the younger population. And I think where we get into a pickle as BCBAs is that we never treat infants. We don't.
Nope, never.
We treat kids. Right. And so we get into this pickle of, okay, I was a parent that worked for my kid. That's what's in all the books. That's what's the most popular thing. And that's what makes the most sense, because when we look at these bedtime behaviors, right, we look at the 7-year-old who comes out of bed 600 times. Instead of assuming that maybe they're just not tired, we assume that it's a behavior and we go, oh, well, they're coming out for attention. Let's just walk them back to bed, walk them back to bed, walk them back to bed, walk them back, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And it's like, are we really setting the child up for the best success? Are we setting the parents up for the best success by doing that method without looking at, hey, he's 7, he shouldn't be going to bed at 6:30, right? He shouldn't be going to bed at 7 o'clock, or shouldn't be, jumping up and down right before bed, or he shouldn't be watching the iPad, whatever. We look at these other sleep stealers and go, okay, what's in control of the reinforcing value of sleep, and how can we manipulate that to avoid sleep training altogether? So we don't ever have to
setting it up for success.
Yeah. And very often we can implement a huge sleep plan that never even includes sleep training, because you can avoid it altogether by just arranging the environment in a certain way so that sleep is more valuable.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm going to pause for a second code word. So for your guys' CEUs today, your second code word is wake windows. So I guess technically it's 2 words, but code word for wake windows. Kind of talking about those behavioral approaches that you kind of teach through Ready, Set, Sleep. What are some specific strategies that BCBAs can implement to improve sleep hygiene before having to get to that sleep training?
Yeah. So sleep hygiene is kind of this, it's a very broad definition. It just basically means the systems that we build up that are going to contribute to healthy sleep.
Okay.
So that's sleep hygiene, basically. Some things fall into good sleep hygiene and some things fall into bad sleep hygiene. And really the good and the bad in it really comes down to how your current sleep is. So I get a lot of people that say oh, I know I shouldn't, be on my phone, but, I fall asleep at 11 and I sleep through the night and I sleep until 7:30 in the morning and I'm getting, 8.5 hours of sleep every night. So to them, I say, doesn't sound like it's a problem for you. Yeah. That's fine. Does it fall into the healthy category of sleep hygiene? No. Is it going to, are there alternatives? Sure. But if you don't have a sleep problem, you don't have a sleep problem, right? Your hygiene is working for your body. But when people come to us with a sleep problem, we want to look at that sleep hygiene, and that starts at morning wake up. We want to make sure that they're waking up at the same time every day, whether they're an adult or a child. Sleeping in on the weekends is not doing us any good. We don't make up sleep. You cannot just make up those lost REM cycles and lost deep sleep.
You can't catch up on the Z's.
Make them up. You cannot catch up on the Z's. like the bearer of bad news, the wah wah. Like here comes Emily and all her bad news. But yeah, I mean, look, sleeping in, you can't make up a sleep. You will feel refreshed. I mean, it is kind of like you do feel refreshed, but there is a cumulative effect of poor sleep that occurs across months, across years. So if you're constantly sleep deprived during the week and constantly making up on the weekend, you are complicit in the deterioration of your health.
Yeah.
Right. You need all the cycles, all the nights. You just do. You're not making up those sleep cycles on the weekends. So if you're sleep deprived, you're sleep deprived. And it is going to take a toll on your health and wellness, mental health, your anxiety, depression, your gut health, your heart health, your everything, your brain health.
It's wild to think that, like, honestly, before the course, I didn't realize that, like, yes, I knew that sleep was important for our health, but I didn't realize how many like explicit effects it has on it, on like our heart health. I can't imagine.
Oh yeah. Heart attack, obesity, stroke, dementia, all of those things point back to poor sleep. And that's just from the sleep sciences, and that's been proven over and over and over again. And so that's why the American Heart Association just 2 years ago, I think, just added sleep as their, I think, sixth pillar, cardiac health.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know how many pillars they have, but they added a
but
pillar.
It's one of them.
They added the newest pillar is sleep. Sleep. Yeah, absolutely. There's a direct correlation. I mean, not even correlation, causation, really.
Yeah.
So
we start with like that wake up time.
Yeah. So we start, back to sleep hygiene. So we start with that wake up time. We want to make sure that, look, people who don't need to nap, right? And, there's a lot of talk out there about the benefits of a quick cat nap. And that's not true. But we also have to look at our total sleep, because if you're taking a cat nap and you're having trouble falling asleep before midnight, I would say you probably shouldn't take that cat nap. If you take a cat nap and are able to fall asleep by 10, 11 o'clock and still achieve 8 hours or so overnight, then that cat nap is working for you. What I find is that people nap, but they're not napping for 18 or 19 minutes, which is the sweet spot for an adult nap. They're napping for an hour and a half or 2 hours. And then they're like, I just can't fall asleep, right? One of my closest friends falls asleep every single night on the couch at 7 o'clock. And then she wakes up at like 8:30. And then she gets into bed and she's like, yeah, I was up until 2. I'm like, it's because that's not a nap at 7 o'clock.
It's like you're going to bed.
Yeah, what are you doing? So I always say, if you're having trouble with your sleep, try not napping.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And
would you say the same for our early learners as well?
I mean, I would say if they're having trouble with overnight sleep and bedtime, I would say, we have to look at that nap. Now, for our 2-year-olds or our 1-year-old, we might just want to look at the timing of that nap, right? Because as the waking window expands, like back to our very first question, as the waking window expands, nap gets later. So we have a lot of 2 and 3-year-olds who might not be going down for their nap until 2 or 3 o'clock because their waking window has expanded. And now they're sleeping until 4 or 5 o'clock. And now bedtime is like 10. And parents are like, they don't go to sleep until 10. And I go, because they're not waking up from their nap until 5. That tracks.
Yeah.
That tracks.
And even those like car naps on the way home from school, like that you don't realize.
Those are the worst.
Pulling away from your... Yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm battling that on my 40-minute drive home from daycare right now. I'm like, stay awake back there.
I know. You're turning on air conditioning. You're like,
the windows. I can't reach back there because I'm really short. So we decided as a family, like, we can do screen time in the car. So we've been sticking like a Ziploc bag with Miss Rachel in it. Like, this will help us sleep.
Yes. And that's what we do too. Oh my gosh. It was Amazon Prime Day and I ordered my little Amazon Fire tablet. I was like, this is Athena's little car ride sleep interrupter.
Yeah. Look, there's a time and a place for screen time. It's not to say that there's no place for screen time in the day. There is. It's just not like in the hours before you want to fall asleep. But yeah, so I mean, like, so that would be like for our younger learners, it's making that judgment, helping the families make that judgment as to, okay, do you want the nap and have a late bedtime? And there's nothing unhealthy about that. If the child's getting an hour and a half nap and then not falling asleep until 10 and then sleeping until 7:30 or 8, they're probably getting the right amount of sleep in 24 hours. But a lot of times families want that time to themselves in the evening, which is fair enough. But we just give the families information saying like, okay, well, if you want an earlier bedtime, we're going to want to either control or drop the nap. But if you're okay with the later bedtime, then we keep the nap. But hey, mom and dad, I'm not going to be able to help you achieve both. I can't help you keep the nap until 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock and have them fall asleep by 7 or 8. I'm not going to be able to help you with that. We're not going to be able to achieve that goal. So I'm out, right? Like you got to, just sort of lay it on the line a little bit is that you kind of can't have it both ways with sleep. But yeah, so that would be another factor. So taking into consideration the nap timing, nap duration, age in relationship to that nap. If it's a 7-year-old taking a nap, I would say that's 7-year-old is probably having garbage sleep. I can predict that. If we have a 12-year-old who's falling asleep during their 4 o'clock session, I'm going to posit that their sleep is garbage.
Yeah.
So it's a red flag, right? It's just a little red flag, and we use it to open up a conversation with them.
Exactly. I wanted to ask about, I feel like this is a common question I've been getting a lot recently with wake up time. I have some families and they often bring to me that their children are waking up in those hours before. Like it's not a very consistent wake up time. It's like around the same, but it's very early. Like say they have a 6:30 wake up time. That's like what they prefer, but their child's waking up at like 5:30 to like 5:15. How do you kind of recommend going about those early wake ups and getting to that consistency?
Yeah, I mean, morning wake ups are more challenging because you have to figure out, is the child getting all the sleep they need and they're waking up at 5:30 because it's the end of their sleep cycle and you're not going to squeeze much more juice out of the bottle, right?
Yeah.
So we have to make that determination. If 5:30 a.m. ends up to be 10 hours after they fell asleep, I'm going to tell family like there's not much we can do.
Sorry.
We need to start easing. Yeah, sorry. We either need to start easing towards a little bit of a later bedtime. And they're like, no, we love bedtime. I'm like, okay, well then you're going to have a 5:30 wake up. Okay. So there's that. So sometimes if the child has had their full night of sleep and it just ends up at 5:30, we can make bedtime a little later, like systematically, maybe 15 or 20 minutes every other night, every third night. And then after maybe 7 to 10 days, their morning wake up will start easing a little bit later. It's not like a direct correlation where if I put them to bed an hour later, they're going to wake up an hour later. Sleep doesn't work like that.
Right.
Okay. So so having enough sleep is one problem, and then they're just done sleeping. That's one thing.
Sure.
The other thing is that 5:30 a.m. wake up coming after a whole night of disruptive awakenings. And then they've just lost their sleep drive, and now they're not going to fall back asleep because they've been up 4 times already. And their body's just in the habit of waking up. And then their final wake up for the day is 5:30, and there's just no way they're going back to sleep. For that, we go back to the bedtime and the bedtime routine and sleep hygiene and what time are we offering bedtime and sleep dependencies and all of that. So for the child who's waking up at, that early time frame, but it's after, a night of multiple awakenings, we go, okay, there's probably some sleep dependencies here. And so we want to clean that up, and they should naturally start, connecting their sleep cycles. And most likely they'll start sleeping later in the morning once they start connecting those sleep cycles overnight. So those are the two kind of culprits of early morning wake ups. The other culprit is sometimes families get out of bed, mom gets up to go to the bathroom, child wakes up, maybe they're co-sleeping, somebody is snoring, someone's sleep talking, someone has to wake up for 5 a.m. to get out of the house and is waking the child up. So those are more controllable variables we just need to figure out.
And we briefly touched on some of those sleep dependencies. We talked about bottles. Can you mention, because I feel like sometimes families don't realize that they're
have one
dependent on some sleep things, like rocking and things like that. So can you mention some of those sleep dependencies that we might see with families?
Oh, the conversation where we have to say it's a you problem. Okay. We would never say that because we're nice people. But no, but we educate on sleep dependency. So parents laying down with their child, that's the number one. And it's not the laying down that's the problem. It's the laying down then leaving.
Yeah.
That's the problem. Co-sleeping is not inherently bad. There's nothing wrong with co-sleeping if the caregiver is going to stay there all night. The problem is
if it works for them.
Right. Absolutely. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But what usually happens is that they're not co-sleeping. The child is, being supported to fall asleep. Parent lays down with them and then they leave the room. And that's the deficient sleep dependency. It's not the laying down. It's you were there when the child fell asleep and then you're gone. So that to me is the number one culprit across the board, not just in our community. I mean, it does shape up in our community sometimes because of safety issues. Sometimes because in an effort to calm the child down, because they had poor sleep hygiene, because they were up and down, jumping around and crazy at bedtime, and families feel like they have to lay down with their child to get them to sleep. That turns into this deficient sleep dependency. And so we can clean things up and get parents out of the falling asleep equation very easily by controlling some of those environmental variables. So I would say laying down with the kid is the most consistent one that we see. And the other thing is things that turn off after bedtime. So the white noise that's on for a duration and then turns off, music that's on for a duration, then turns off, the light that's on for a duration and then turns off, sucking the bottle to sleep, and then the bottle drains and then they need the more bottle. Usually when kids have disruptive middle of the night awakenings, it's almost 100% likely that they're coming to the parent to get access to whatever it was. So the child who is sucking the bottle goes back and needs more bottle. The child who has a caregiver laying down wants the caregiver to come lay down. The child that was being held wants the parent to come back and hold them. The child who fell asleep on the couch wants to go back to the couch because they were transferred after they fell asleep. So we usually see a revisitation to exactly what was going on at bedtime. They want that exact thing back. They want that exact same thing. And that goes back to the idea that they're not trying to just come out of bed and just be dorks. They're trying to come out of bed and get back to sleep. Like, please, can someone just help me get back to that primary reinforcer? I want to go back to bed. I just don't know how to do it too.
And I think that goes back to just kind of the importance in touching on, when we're looking at, a lot of times we do look at sleep by the function as BCBAs before we have education. So can you kind of reiterate that to our community of how we can get that function and how it might not be applicable?
Yeah. Yusra, did you have a question? I'm sorry. We kind of
that's exactly what I was about to ask. So not necessarily, because I always look at let's look at the function, but it's more important to look at what reinforcer they might be a little different.
Yeah. What the function, man. That's what I say about this function-based sleep intervention. I mean, look, you can look at a bedtime behavior, and let's just take the most basic one. The child comes out of bed 100 times, right? That's the most obvious one. Whether it's in the middle of the night or whether it's at bedtime, child won't stay in bed. So we go in and we go, okay, well, what happens when they come out of bed? What do you do? Oh, okay. I sit with them. I lay with them. I walk them back to bed. I yell at them. Whatever it is, we go, oh, attention. Or, they'll say, well, we don't do anything. We don't give it any attention. We just walk them back to bed. And then we go, oh, escape. There must be escape, right? And we can look at that behavior 5,000 times. We can videotape it. We can record it. We can look at it in slow motion. It will always probably look like escape or attention, right?
Yeah.
But what we neglect in that contingency management, right? What we neglect in that assessment is the reinforcing value of sleep.
Right.
We forget about that. We forget, okay, what is controlling? Why isn't the child tired enough to fall asleep? Why isn't the bed reinforcing enough? Why isn't the readiness there? Why aren't they accessing the primary reinforcer? And so walking them back to bed is like just a Band-Aid on the problem. It doesn't actually address the core problem that the schedule's off, that their sleep hygiene needs to be adjusted, that they're waking up at different times every morning, that they're sleep dependent on something. It just, that basic ABCing really ignores how sleep works in the brain. And all of the stuff that's going on outside of the ABC.
Those things that we don't consider. Thank you, for breaking that down, because I think almost all of us are going to look at it that way without having this education on the sleep component.
Yeah, and look, it's not wrong. It's not inherently wrong. We're doing our job, right? I mean, we are. I mean,
and that's what we were taught to do.
Like, it's our training.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what we're taught to do. So it's not wrong. It's just incomplete.
Right. So I kind of have to ask, I know you've been doing this a very long time. Can you share a success story or an example of where like behavioral interventions you use significantly improve like sleep outcomes for your learner and like or help the family maybe?
Yes.
We love a good success story.
Yes. Okay. I actually just shared this one on LinkedIn last week. Or was it earlier this week? It's my favorite. I know it's my very favorite story because I have a lot of colleagues that like listen to the podcast I'm on and like follow me on LinkedIn. Old colleagues from my early days in clinic and stuff. And everybody knew this kid. This kid was just, everyone in clinic knew him. Everybody, like we had probably 4 or 5 different BCBAs on his case across the 10 years that, we worked with him. We got him real young. Mom was like super awesome. I mean, like just a really complicated kid, a lot of scratching, screeching, shouting, yelling, very low verbal output. He was turned into a big kid across the time that we were working with him. And it didn't come out until he was almost 12 that he had a sleep problem. And yes. And so we had all been working on him. We all knew this guy. I mean, he was just known because he would flop down on the ground and he's big, right? Like he was probably 5 foot, probably 2 or 3 at 12 years old and easily 150 pounds. Easily
bigger than me and you, Swap.
Right? Yeah. Easily 150. 160, if not bigger. And, he had trouble cutting his nails. Mom refused to cut his nails because it would end up so he had real long nails and he was a scratcher. So people were real afraid of him and his behaviors, he would, punch holes in the walls. I mean, his escalations were really severe. But the sweetest kid on the face of the planet, but very volatile. And so it didn't come out until maybe like probably 7 years after we had started working with him that he had a really bad sleep problem. And Mom reported that, eventually he ended up sleeping in the bed in between her and her husband at 12 at this huge size. And I was like, are you guys sleeping? And she's like, no, we don't sleep now. But she said every time we try to put him in his bed, he freaks out. He doesn't want to go in his room. He won't even go in his room at night, right? If we try and guide him toward his bedroom, even if we have his favorite music playing, he'll go in there for like a minute and then he'll leave because he kind of knows what's going on next, right? So I took this kiddo and I was like, all right, this is my project. We're going to get him better sleep. And I worked with Mom and we first and foremost worked on sensitizing him to his bedroom. We got him happy in his room. We did session into his room. We did playing in his room. We had him sitting on his bed. We had him laying on his bed during the day when sleep was not expected. And then we had Mom kind of move it closer and closer and closer to bedtime. We made it really preferable. Just the environment was pleasing to him. It took about 2 or 3 weeks to get the environment to where he would set foot in there at bedtime.
Wow.
And we then had Mom co-sleep with him in his room where she put a mattress on the floor. So she co-slept with him in his room, got him sleeping in his bed, which he had never done.
Oh my gosh.
Right. So we eased it, right? We didn't just leave him in there. Mom was there too. So he tolerated sleeping in the bed with mom. And then we slowly faded mom out using some quiet-based visiting, some scheduled exits. And I would say within a month total, he was completely going into bed, falling asleep by himself, sleeping.
That's amazing.
At all. Like,
So,
that's amazing.
That's quick.
That was my
That's quicker than it takes some baby.
And I love it most because a lot of my old colleagues that I talk to, they all know who this guy is. And it's just like so fun.
Just their hearts.
Yes. And they all saw the progression too. And then they also saw the progression after he started sleeping through the night of him being able to tolerate nail cutting, of him being able to tolerate changes. His flopping on the floor at clinic decreased. I mean, all the things just started going better because he was now getting better quality of sleep. Because think about being a large person in a bed with two other large people. Like the quality of sleep is just not good, right?
Sometimes I don't even want to share a bed with my husband. I want the whole thing.
Yeah, get out.
Yes, I agree. Like, come on, you're snoring. That's it. I'm going into the guest room. So anyway, that's my success story. I love that. But that's
an amazing story.
That's just one of many. And you know, I love telling stories about my old client, but he's my favorite. But I've got lots for that. It's just it's just significant. There aren't any kids who just can't sleep.
Right.
Everyone has a potential and possibility to do it. It's just knowing the strategies. Emily, what are some of the common challenges that you think BCBAs might encounter when they're starting to implement some of the strategies for sleep, and how can we overcome them?
So if we are really conscious about what we're doing, there really shouldn't be any behavioral escalations. There shouldn't be any complexities coming from the child. Sometimes we get caregivers who just aren't bought in. So getting that buy-in, and I find that just through education, just through helping them understand how sleep works in the brain, the importance of sleep, what those sleep dependencies are, waking windows, sometimes just giving them the context, they have more buy-in. Very often caregivers automatically think it's going to be quite behavioral. And so sometimes if we come in with guns blazing and we're like, we have a sleep plan for you, sometimes they won't even look at it, or they won't even listen to you because they just assume, because they have tried absolutely everything on the face of the planet. Like, what do you have to offer me? I've literally tried everything. And so sometimes there's a little resistance there at the beginning. And some of that has to do with, rapport building and really asking a lot of questions and not making too much assumptions. I would say was kind of the first way to overcome any pushback. But really, as far as setbacks, any kind of a setback could happen. I mean, sleep is really volatile. The child could get sick. One of the caregivers could get sick. Someone could go away. They might get a new BT in the middle of the process. They might, grandma might move in for a week or something like that. Sleep is just volatile. It's the one thing that suffers no matter what, no matter who you are. Sleep is always the thing that goes off track. But I mean, those are, I think, the most common things is the stuff we can't control, which would be like illness, something like that. Children are always going to get sick right in the middle of when you start your plan.
I think this is something that you can enlighten us on, because it's what you enlightened me on. Because when I was doing your course, you and I met, and I was also doing sleep training with my daughter. And every single time I would start sleep training, she got an ear infection. She had a bad diaper rash. She had this, that, the other thing. And you were like, Kirsten, it's okay if she's sick that you put it on hold and you still promote those sleep dependencies. It's okay to still do those things. You can always repair. And I think that it's important for families to know that, you're going to cuddle your kid when they're sick, and that's okay.
Yes, we're not BCBA holes, right? Isn't that what they say? Let's cuddle your child. If they're sick, hug them. Don't not hug them. This comes up as a very common question that parents have, and some pushback is, what parents hear when we say like sleep dependencies and laying down with your child is, probably causing all those middle of the night wakings. What they hear is, oh, I can't cuddle my child. I can't lay down with my child. And that's not what we're saying. I think it's really important because for many of our families, bedtime is the only time they get that physical connection with their child, right? It's the only time they get that loving engagement throughout an entire day, perhaps. So I would never take that away from the family, but it comes down to timing, right? Are you going to do that all the way until they're asleep? Or do you have the capacity and the tools to leave just a minute or two before they actually fall asleep so that you're giving them all that love and cuddles and awesomeness, but then leaving strategically at the time when their eyes are going to close and they're actually going to fall asleep. So there's a difference. And we don't want parents to not be parents, right? We want them to do all that awesome stuff. And we don't want to be those people who come in and be like, don't lay down with your child. It's awful. Like, it's not awful. It's amazing. No. We just want to time it better so that it doesn't become this, dependency that's then going to lead to frustration in the middle of the night for everything.
Yeah. Right. It makes a lot of sense. So in your role, have you had experience with collaborating with other professionals like speech and OT when it comes to like your sleep intervention, and how important is it?
Oh, absolutely. I would say less so speech and more so OT. I mean, I let everybody, when I was in the clinic setting and I worked side by side with speech and OT, we just collaborated naturally. But I'll be honest, most of what I learned early on came from the OT I was co-treating with. The occupational therapist that was in my ecosystem that I saw every single day, actually the team, there was 3 of them. I would spend a lot of time in their office just asking them about up and down vestibular motion versus back and forth vestibular motion, high impact sensory input versus that calming sensory input. I would ask them about the impact on sleep. What does that do to the brain? What are the hormones that are getting released? They know that information. So very early on, I collaborated with them just in general so I could get more knowledge so that I could really understand and make sure that I was doing things that were ethical and do no harm with the children when I was changing some of those sensory experiences for them. I got a lot of enlightenment on again, off again sensory input, intermittent input, because that is going to be the most effective. And these kids that are just constantly seeking that input, it's actually not good for their sensory system to just be in constant sensory seeking mode. We want to offer that offset. So I learned a lot early on from occupational therapists. And then as we moved into treatment, like co-treating with the particular learners, I always had them come up with the sensory diet or the sensory experience. I always had them do the preference assessments just because it was easier, because it was more within their wheelhouse. But they taught me how to do that same thing. It's no different than a preference assessment. If you tickle a child, lightly on their arm, some children are going to give you the look of death and run from you. And some kids are going to almost fall asleep, right? They're going to be like, oh, that's awesome. And I think that's true for all of us. My husband hates when I scratch his back in a tickly way. He likes me to dig the skin off of his back, right? And it's just all of our sensory systems are just slightly different, right? To what we like as far as touch goes and sensory input and what we don't like. I go on a carousel and I want to vomit. And it's my kids want to go on the whirly spinny thing because they think it's awesome. So, we do have to do those preference assessments. So as far as collaboration early on, I would have the OT do that. Sometimes I get permission from occupational therapists to do a certain kind of treatment. Sometimes families will do things like they'll keep the weighted vest on their child all day long. And so I'll say something like, hey, maybe run that by your OT. I'm not sure that that's how it's intended on being used. My understanding is that it's supposed to be on and off and on and off. Will you just run it by, or would you like me to reach out to your OT and talk about that? So sometimes it's about dispelling some myths and that the idea that more is better. I think even in the ABA world, we sometimes think more is better. Jumping will make them more focused or something like that, or more rate will make them more responsive. But what we end up doing is we end up just desensitizing the sensory system to those sensory experiences, and they just need more and more and more and more because their threshold increases. And again, I learned that from an OT. I didn't learn that from me. Like,
Right.
I worked side by side with the team so that I could bring this information to other people. Just these things that are just not well known. And I always go back to like, hey, if you don't know, ask. Hey, if you're not sure, ask your pediatrician. Hey, if you're not sure, ask your OT. There's always places to get the information if you don't have the information. So,
yeah, exactly. And like knowing that like we're BCBAs, we have a ton of information. We don't have it all.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. We just need to know where to get it.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. With that, I just kind of want to, and thank you so much for joining us. And I wanted to talk a little bit about your Ready, Set, Sleep, and kind of two questions. Where do you see Ready, Set, Sleep going as far as like sleep specializations, and then the future of behavioral sleep treatments in general? What are you hoping for in the future?
I am hoping, my dream is that every BCBA has access to this information, because sleep is so pervasive. Poor sleep is so pervasive in our field. No matter what area we're working on, like I work side by side with a lot of BCBAs who are working in the health and wellness space. They're not even treating the autism spectrum, which is fine. Like there's a lot of things we can do with our ABA, superpowers. But in the health and wellness space, you're going to deal with adults with poor sleep, right? In the foster care system, we're going to be dealing with kids with poor sleep. In the neurotypical population, in the school-based treatment, we're going to be dealing with humans with poor sleep. But we're uniquely positioned to be able to work side by side with these families using behavioral strategies to improve and enhance sleep quality, sleep onset, and sleep health in general. So my dream is that Ready, Set, Sleep touches every BCBA in some way so that people at least have a basic understanding of sleep so that they can go out and treat. That's my goal, is to equip other BCBAs to do the treatment. I don't want it all for myself. I can't treat all of the children on the planet, but I wish, right? Like, whole world.
Right.
That's not the business model. I'm probably a little too, I give my information to everybody, like, right. I just want everybody to have it. I think getting certified is really important. That's why I came up with the Sleep Collective. That's why I'm going through accreditation now. That's why I have a sleep certification program, so that everyone has access to ongoing resources, so that if the answer is, I don't know, and I encourage that a lot. Like, I don't want everyone to have the answers. I want people to know where to go to find the answers. I think trying to have the answers in your head is slippery slope, right? So through the Sleep Collective, we have a resource vault. We have an internal community of certificates, so we can communicate with each other, stay up on research, sleep research, and autism research. Myth busting. We do a lot of myth busting. I share a lot of podcasts. I know, I share a lot of podcasts and resources. I just think we're in a field that's constantly changing, and sleep sciences are constantly changing, and we're always finding new ways and new methods and new information. And I think I'm just really, passionate about giving that information away and making sure my certificates have all the information at their fingertips, and that my certificates are equipped to go out and disseminate this information to other BCBAs. I don't care. Take the Sleep Collective. Don't take the Sleep Collective. But if you just take the Sleep Collective, I want you to be able to go out and do good and go and disseminate and really just eradicate the sleep problems in our community. A better slept earth is a better slept world. I just feel like people would be so much happier if they were getting more sleep.
I agree. I love that.
Really? I feel like some people are so mean. I look at them with passion, the compassion, and I'm just like, oh, honey, you just didn't have a.
I love that. Oh, honey, you just didn't sleep good.
Oh, honey, you just didn't sleep well. It's okay. I'll take all your meanness. If you're gonna be mean, that's okay. Like, I understand. You're probably just tired. Poor Lisa.
Definitely. I love that you're sharing all this information with the whole community, the world. And I do hope it reaches everyone because you brought so much knowledge to me in like the short time. I know Kirsten's taken the collective, so she knows a lot more than me. I've really appreciated your insight. So one last question I have for you is what advice would you give to BCBAs who are just starting to incorporate sleep interventions into their practice?
Yeah, I would just say ask questions, ask a lot of questions, try not to make assumptions, especially when it comes to ABCing the bedtime behaviors. Reach out, do Google searches about waking windows. If you're not going to get the information from me, get the information from somewhere else, but try and, just elevate your level of information. Just keep learning, right? I mean, I don't know everything. I tell people in the Sleep Collective, I don't know everything, but I'm curious enough to go find the answers. Because I never want to make a wrong assumption, because wrong assumptions lead to bad outcomes. And we don't want bad outcomes for our families. We want solid outcomes for our families, not bad outcomes for our families. So I just say be curious and just keep asking questions and, keep learning. I love it. Sleep is I love learning about sleep. Kristen knows I'm like constantly like, oh, look at this book I found. I mean, look at this podcast I found. Look at this blog I found. Oh. There's so much to learn about. There really so much. Really is. So much out there. So much out there.
With that, I wanted to give our last code word to our listeners who are trying to get a little bit more education on sleep. So night wakings, another 2-word code word for you. Night wakings.
Whoa. All right. And then on that note, Emily, thank you for coming on, talking to us about sleep. It was amazing. And we hope to maybe you can come on again as you learn more. And then we'll talk to you guys all later.
It would be my pleasure. Bye. Thank you guys so much for your time.
Thank you so much. See you.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want your CEU credits, go to our website at blossomchildrencenter.com. Talk to you later. See you.